The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Chen's penthouse as he stood frozen in his doorway, keys still trembling in his hand. What he saw in his kitchen would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman who had quietly cleaned his home for 3 years. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across a scene so unexpected, so profoundly human, that the billionaire who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals without blinking found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to comprehend the beautiful secret Maria Santos had been hiding in plain sight. Marcus had built his empire on reading people, on seeing through facades and calculating human nature down to the last decimal point. But standing there, watching Maria tenderly spoon soup into the mouth of a frail elderly woman he'd never seen before, he realized he'd been blind to the most extraordinary person in his own home. The flight from Tokyo had been brutal, 14 hours of turbulence that left even his seasoned stomach queasy. He'd planned to surprise his assistant by returning 2 days early from the merger negotiations, maybe catch up on some paperwork in the quiet of his pristine Manhattan apartment. The last thing he expected was to find his normally empty kitchen transformed into something that looked like a makeshift care facility. Maria hadn't noticed him yet. She was completely absorbed in her gentle ministrations, speaking softly in Spanish to the woman whose weathered hands shook as they reached for the spoon. "Despacio, Mama Elena," she whispered. "Take your time." Marcus's throat tightened as he watched this woman, this janitor he barely acknowledged beyond polite nods and holiday bonuses, to demonstrate a tenderness he hadn't seen since his own grandmother's final days. The elderly woman's eyes were clouded with confusion, but they lit up when Maria smiled at her, and Marcus could see pure love reflected between them. "Is that better?" Maria asked, switching to accented English as she adjusted a pillow behind the woman's back. "You need to eat to stay strong for me." It was then that Marcus noticed the details that painted the full picture of Maria's hidden world. A small air mattress in the corner where she'd clearly been sleeping, prescription bottles lined up on his granite countertop like soldiers, a wheelchair folded neatly by the window. His expensive kitchen had been transformed into a caring sanctuary, and he'd never known. Maria must have sensed his presence because she turned, and her face went white with terror. The spoon clattered to the floor as she jumped up, her hands flying to smooth her uniform. "Mr. Chen, I can explain," as she stammered, her voice breaking with panic. "I know this looks terrible, and I know you're going to fire me, but please, just give me until tomorrow to find somewhere else for her to." "Stop." Marcus's voice came out rougher than he intended. He stepped into the kitchen, his Italian leather shoes squeaking against the tile. "Just stop talking for a minute." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she positioned herself protectively between Marcus and the elderly woman, who had begun to look agitated at the raised voices. "Please don't call the police," Maria whispered. "She's not dangerous. She's just scared and confused, and the nursing home said they'd have a bed next week, but that was 6 weeks ago. And I couldn't leave her on the street." "I couldn't." "Who is she?" Marcus asked quietly, his eyes never leaving the elderly woman's face. "My neighbor," Maria said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Elena Vasquez. She raised 7 children by herself after her husband died. She used to babysit for half the building when I was little. She has Alzheimer's, and her family couldn't afford to keep paying for her care. They just left her." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. "Left her?" Her son moved to California and stopped returning her calls. Her daughter changed her phone number. The landlord evicted her last month because she kept forgetting to pay rent, and Adult Protective Services said the waitlist for affordable care facilities is 18 months long. Maria's voice grew stronger with righteous anger. 18 months. Mr. Chen. They expected me to just let her wander the streets for 18 months. Marcus looked around his kitchen, this sterile, magazine-perfect space that he used maybe twice a month, and saw it differently now. The warmth that Maria had brought to it, the love that filled every corner. "So you brought her here?" he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Maria nodded miserably. "I know it was wrong. I know I violated your trust and probably broke 50 laws, but I've been saving every penny to try to pay for a decent place for her. And I thought if I was careful, if I only brought her here during the day when you were at work, maybe I could keep her safe until I figured something out." "During the day?" Marcus frowned. "Where has she been sleeping?" The question seemed to deflate Maria completely. "In my studio apartment, on my couch." "But she wanders at night, and my neighbors complained, and the building manager said if she disturbed anyone else, he'd evict us both. So I started bringing her here where it's quiet, where she could rest without bothering anyone." Marcus walked slowly to where Elena sat, her confused eyes tracking his movement. When he crouched down to her eye level, she smiled at him with the innocent joy of someone whose mind had returned to childhood. "Hola, guapo," she said, reaching out to pat his cheek. ¿Eres mi nieto? Marcus didn't speak Spanish, but he understood the gentleness in her touch, the hope in her voice that he might be someone who loved her. His throat closed up completely. "She thinks you're her grandson," Maria translated softly. "She does that with kind faces." Marcus stood up slowly, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. He thought about his own grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident, how she'd worked 3 jobs to keep him in private school, how she'd died alone in a county hospital because he'd been too busy building his company to visit as often as he should have. "Maria," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "How much does a good memory care facility cost?" Maria blinked in confusion. What? Answer the question. How much? The nice ones? About 8,000 a month. But Mr. Chen, I wasn't asking you for her. And how long has she been staying here? About 6 weeks. Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone. I'm going to make some calls. Mr. Chen, please, I'll have her out of here by tonight. Just please don't. I'm not calling the police, Maria. Marcus looked at her directly for what felt like the first time in 3 years of working together. I'm calling the best memory care facility in the city. And then I'm calling my lawyer to set up a trust fund. The words hung in the air between them. Maria stared at him as if he'd started speaking in tongues. Why? She whispered. Marcus looked around the kitchen again at the evidence of Maria's secret life of sacrifice and love, and then back at Elena, who was humming softly to herself, lost in some distant, happier memory. Because, he said simply, this is the most human thing that's ever happened in this apartment. And because 3 years ago, you asked if you could water my plants. And I said I didn't have any plants because I kill everything I touch. But you've been nurturing life here all along, haven't you? Maria's tears spilled over. Mr. Chen, because people like Elena raised people like you, who risk everything to do what's right. And people like you remind people like me what we're actually working for. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for his attorney's number. Because I've spent 15 years building wealth, and I've never once used it for something that actually mattered. As Marcus dialed, Elena began singing a Spanish lullaby in a voice cracked with age but sweet with memory. Maria sat down beside her and joined in, their voices harmonizing in the golden light of the kitchen candles. Marcus stepped into the hallway to make his calls, but he could still hear them singing. For the first time in years, his apartment felt like a home. 2 hours later, after a dozen phone calls and one hastily arranged video conference with the director of Manhattan's most exclusive memory care facility, Marcus returned to find Maria sitting on the floor beside Elena's chair, both women asleep. Elena's hand rested on Maria's head like a blessing. Marcus grabbed a throw blanket from his living room and gently covered them both. Then he sat down at his kitchen island and did something he hadn't done in his own home since he'd bought it. He stayed. He watched over them while they slept, these two remarkable women who had taught him that the most valuable things in life can't be bought, only given freely from the heart. When Maria woke up at dawn, she found a handwritten note on the counter next to a cup of coffee that Marcus had somehow managed to make without waking them. Maria Elena has a permanent spot at Sunrise Manor, the best memory care facility in the city. All expenses covered, no waiting list. You have a permanent spot here too, if you want it, and not as my janitor, but as Elena's advocate and my friend. We all need someone who sees us as human. Thank you for seeing her. Thank you for seeing me. Marcus. Maria cried as she read it, tears of relief and gratitude falling onto the expensive paper. When she looked up, she saw Marcus standing in the doorway of his bedroom, dressed for another day of making millions, but looking somehow different, softer, more real. Thank you, she whispered. Marcus smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Thank you for reminding me why any of this matters. 6 months later, Marcus's friends and business associates still couldn't understand why the billionaire CEO spent his Sunday afternoons at a memory care facility, playing checkers with an elderly woman who usually couldn't remember his name. They couldn't understand why he'd hired Maria as the director of his new non-profit foundation, or why he'd moved to a smaller apartment so he could be closer to people who needed help. But Marcus understood perfectly. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. Sometimes coming home early is exactly what your heart needs. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can discover isn't hidden at all. It's right there in your kitchen, waiting for you to finally open your eyes and see the beautiful humanity that's been there all along.